Going to go ahead and get started just to respect everybody's time. So welcome. My name is Jen Fleming, and I am the Career Advisor for Education, Nonprofit, and Government here at DePaul. And we're really excited to be able to bring you this event today. I'm going to go ahead and let my colleague Libby introduce herself as well, and I'm just going to go through a few quick things, and then we'll be introducing our guest.
Hi everyone, my name is Libby Woodard. I am the Employer Engagement Specialist for Education, Nonprofit, and Government. So I work with Jen here at DePaul in the Career Center.
So today we are going to be recording. Just as a heads up, we're going to record the event, so anybody that is RSVP'd on Handshake will receive a follow-up email, usually a few days later, because it has to go through our communications team with the recording of this event. So if for some reason you can't stay for the entire time, know that that will be shared, and then any materials or resources that are shared will be in that follow-up email as well. Really quickly, if you're able to have your camera on, I know, myself, when I've been a guest speaker, totally appreciate it. We know that that's not always possible for everyone, and if that's not, that's completely okay as well. And so I am going to go ahead and let our wonderful alum who has joined us today, Gracie, go ahead and introduce herself, and then we'll kick off our questions. I'll be asking and moderating questions with Gracie, and then we'll leave some time at the end for you all to be able to ask questions, but also feel free to put those in the chat.
Hi, everyone. Gracie, I'm really excited to be with you guys. I graduated last year, 2020. I actually used to work at the Career Center as well, so things have come full circle for me. I am teaching at Evergreen Park High School. So that's right outside of Chicago on the south side. And I teach freshman and senior English, but I come from a long line of teachers in a variety of different subject areas and age levels. So if you have quite specific questions about that, feel free to ask me. We don't have to have the same content or be working with the same age group for me to reflect with you. So thanks for being here, and I'm excited to get going.
Awesome. So Gracie, can you tell us a little bit about your current role and the journey to getting there? So for instance, when you first started considering teaching, how you built some related experience as well?
So I am a little bit unique in that I've always wanted to be a teacher. My dad's a teacher. So if you asked me when I was in first grade what I wanted to be when I grew up, I would have told you I want to be a teacher. But I seriously started to gain experience and figure out that that's the path I wanted when I was in high school and in college. So a couple of things I did in college was like working at the Career Center, doing like some one-on-one mentoring, as well as another office for DePaul. So those were really great experiences. Anytime you can work with youth to make sure that you like this age group, would be great. So any type of work you can expose yourself to before teaching, making sure that, in figuring out that you maybe you do like working with high schoolers, or maybe you do prefer the little ones, whatever your niche is. So that's my first step. The second one, and this is related to some other questions that will be asked later, but when I was student teaching, I made sure I did my observation hours at the same school so that I spent the whole year with them. And again, not everyone has the ability to do that, but if you do, trying to spend as much time as the school you're going to student teach in is fantastic to build relationships with those students. And like I said, you want to have interactions with students before you student teach, because it would be such a shame for you to get to student teaching and then realize, oh, I don't actually want to be a teacher. So interacting with students, whether that be a summer camp, working in some sort of higher ed job where you're being a mentor, exposing yourself to different age groups is going to be really helpful in determining that, yes, this is the path I want to take.
Great. And I know you kind of mentioned student teaching, and a little later on we are going to get into kind of advice around the first year specifically of teaching. But can you walk us through, your job search process after that student teaching experience, what that looked like?
Yes. So something to keep in mind is that as a first year teacher, you have to be flexible about where you want to teach, right? And you have to be flexible that some of us, might not have any endorsements yet, right? So you have to keep in mind that sometimes schools look for specific endorsements. So don't take rejection too harshly. Just to give you some perspective, I started applying and well, COVID put things a little bit behind, but sometimes positions start popping up in February, but March for sure. And I think I applied to over 30 schools. Over 30 schools. And I only heard back from 2. So that's the reality, it's just what it is. And when I was going in, so I teach at Evergreen Park, like I mentioned earlier, when I was asked to be in the interview, they let me know we had over 200 applicants for this position. So that is something that I'm not saying to scare you, but I'm just trying to encourage you to apply to as many schools as you possibly can and be flexible about where you start off. Where you start off is not necessarily where you end up. And that's important to remember. Sometimes we limit ourselves to only applying to schools in this specific area. That's great if you have an in with that community, but if you don't know anyone from that community, it might be really hard to find a job. So be very flexible because until you earn tenure, and I don't want to just throw out that term, tenure is something that you earn after your first 4 years of teaching. Essentially, it means that they can't just fire you for anything. So until you earn tenure, the enrollment could drop in that school and they could fire you, and that just would be it. So it takes 4 years to earn that sense of security. And so I would suggest that until you earn that tenure, that you are looking for other options and understanding that where you start doesn't have to be where you end up, but just applying to as many schools as you possibly can is something I highly encourage.
I think that's really good advice. And I appreciate pointing out like where you start is not necessarily where you end. I also thank you for those specific numbers of applying to 30 jobs and hearing back from 2, because I think, we tend to underestimate maybe how many actual applications we might need to put in to get to that point where we're actually getting interviews secured. So that's super helpful. Can you describe your interview process for us?
Yes. So when I'm prepping for an interview, I want to really stress to you guys that you should practice interviewing. All right. So whether that be through, the DePaul Career Center, which I obviously highly encourage, you practice interviewing with the career coaches and the career advisors. I really highly encourage that. Or if you have another friend who is in education and you want to do a practice interview with them, that's really important. So that's number 1, practice. Number 2, when you get called in for an interview for a school, research that school, right? Don't show up and then not know anything about, the student body. Maybe it's a school of need, which is a school that has 30% or more of students living at or below the poverty line. Maybe it's a school that has a lot of emergent bilinguals. Maybe it's a school that has a lot of co-curriculars that you want to get involved in. So do your research on the school and bring up key points during the interview to show that you did your research on that school. That's really important. So I would say practice interviewing and research the school before you go into the interview.
Great. And then for your interview specifically, can you walk us through, obviously this looks different depending on who's doing the interview. Sometimes there could potentially be, you have to do a lesson in front of students, or you have to meet with an entire grade level of teachers, or it's just with the principal. It really seems to vary. Can you talk to us about what your format of your interview looked like in the process, how many times you had to interview for this specific job that you secured?
Yes. So at Evergreen Park, and again, I was interviewing during COVID, so that impacted it. So when, people who are looking for a job for next year, you may be doing a virtual interview, so just be prepared for that. But my process last spring when I was interviewing at Evergreen Park, I first had to do a screening. So this is very common. So if they're interested in you, it'll kind of look like a robot email, and you are getting an interview screening. Hopefully the department chair or principal or HR reaches out to you to explain what this robot email is. But you're going to do a screening in which you are recording yourself. So it's usually like 4 or 5 questions, and you get the chance to practice each question 2 or 3 times, and then you record your answer, and that's what gets submitted to the school. So that's usually round 1. That's called an interview screening. That's very common for step 1. And then once the school reviews those screenings, so let's say, I'm just going to throw out some numbers here. Let's say that there was 10 people they were interested in, so they did the screening. From those 10, they'll then pick maybe like 4 people to bring in to interview face-to-face. And that second interview typically is with a department chair. You typically don't go straight to the principal just because the principal has so much going on. So some sort of like department chair, or like, yeah, I would say department chair, sometimes instructional coach, someone like middle tier administration like that. And that's usually with like 2 or 3 people. Sometimes they'll bring in another teacher. And then if you do well there, then they'll ask you for a third interview, in which that is sometimes where you do a lesson. And that's when the higher administration comes in and watches you and can speak to you afterwards. I did not have the chance to do that practice lesson because of COVID. But Evergreen Park did tell me that in my third interview, when I finally met with the principal and the director of curriculum, that, you know, if this was a normal year, we would be bringing you in to teach a lesson during this time. So instead of teaching a lesson, I just had to submit a lesson and just walk them through what I would have done. So it's usually like 3 interviews before that you get the offer. So,
yeah, that's super helpful. And how long, did that whole process take from when you applied to when you actually got the offer?
From when I applied, at least a month. At least a month. Yeah. You know, some schools might move a little quicker just because they're trying to fill that spot up, you know, but it takes at least a month. And even after they offer you the job, you have to wait to get board approval. So every school has a school board, which consists of community members. So the principal might offer you the job, but then they have to submit the paperwork officially through that school district's board. They approve it. It's usually just a formality, and then you get the contract. So at least a month, but probably more with this whole process, because it's 3 interviews plus the board has to approve you. So we're talking at least a month, if not more. And sometimes, and don't get frustrated with this, sometimes the reason why a position has opened up is because another teacher might be leaving. So if a position says anticipated teacher, that might mean that someone is probably leaving, but they don't know 100% for sure yet, right? So sometimes another teacher might be leaving and they've been offered a job and they're most likely going to take it, but it's not for certain. So if it says anticipated, that means that it might take even a little bit longer, just because there's extra hoops to jump through to ensure that, yes, indeed, someone else is leaving and that they can bring you in.
Yeah, and that's super helpful. And what I would say is, you know, Gracie's kind of description and her process is very typical of suburban districts. I would say in CPS, it looks a little bit different and there's some more variability. And there's not necessarily some of the like having to be approved by the board or things
Sure.
of that nature, which might look a little bit different. But I would say, you know, what you just described is very, very common for suburban, and even a lot of the aspects are common for CPS, whether it's having to teach a lesson, having to have 3 separate rounds. All of those are definitely common throughout, you know, all of the different districts. So that's super helpful. What do you think was the most challenging part of the job and interview process?
Yeah, the first one was rejection. That was the hardest thing to swallow, right? Because we all like to think of ourselves really well. We all are very proud of the resume that we've been able to build, the experience that we've accumulated. And it's like, wow, I applied to 30 schools and I only heard back from 2. Like, wow, that's not, that's kind of that's not a good rate there. But don't take it. As rejection, right? Take it as motivation. Okay, because the reality is, yes, when I applied, there's 200 people applying for that same job. So don't take rejection as something to make you lose motivation. Instead, make it motivate you to apply to as many schools as you possibly can. um, Another one of the challenges um, is it's not really a challenge, but it's more of a reminder that when you apply for a job, it's always good to do your research of who your boss might be. So, for instance, like me being an English teacher, every school I applied to, I found the English department chair and introduced myself. Hi, so and so, I'm Gracie Garbrecht. I just applied to this position. Here's a little bit about me. If you have, I asked where are things in the hiring process. If there's any additional information I could provide, please let me know. So I did that. And I think that might have helped, because if you reach out to someone from that school who could potentially be your boss, they might look for your name in the application. So that's a really it's not really a challenge, but more of a reminder to do that for every job you apply to.
Sure. And what would you do differently next time, as you're thinking about and reflecting on this process that you went through last year? Is there something that you would change next time around?
Yes. So in any interview, really, not just teaching, they always end the interview with, okay, so do you have any questions? Right. And I asked questions that I thought were like something that would make me sound good, right? So I asked questions about like, oh, what kind of professional development do you offer? Like, which is a good question. It's a good question. Don't get me wrong. But I asked the type of questions that would make me sound good. I didn't ask questions that would tell me more about the school. So for instance, like at Evergreen Park, it has a very diverse population. A question I wish I would have asked is, how is diversity celebrated in your school? And then how the administration answered that could have told me more about the school climate. So don't forget in your interviews to ask questions like that, very specific to school climate or, just professional climate, to figure out a little bit more about that school. Because then that could help you with the decision of, okay, is this a place where I want to be?
I think that's great advice. So this was obviously a particularly unique year for teaching. I think anybody's first year of teaching, comes with a lot of challenges and rewards. But given COVID, can you, describe your experience a little bit this past year for us?
Yes. So, fingers crossed that we have a little bit more normalcy next year. And I don't know what all of you will be experiencing, but this is what happened for me. So we started off as fully remote, and that was very isolating as a new person, because I didn't even really hang out with my coworkers, like at lunch or anything. Like, that was very isolating. And then we moved into hybrid, which was like half in person, half at home. That was a little bit better, but managing safety was definitely a challenge. Then we went back to fully remote around the holiday season, again, feeling very isolated, and my students probably felt the same way. Now we're back in hybrid. During that time, the bell schedule, I think, has changed like 3 times. So this year has really taught me to be flexible, and the details of things, you got to let them go. You really do. Because if you get hung up on, oh, it's so not fair that this is happening, there's a million things not fair or frustrating that are going to happen in a school year. So really keep in mind, especially since who knows what next year is going to look like, to be flexible in whatever your school district is doing. And it's easy to, so I've seen, and I've even reflected that I have some days like this, to bring some of your frustrations into the classroom. You don't want to do that, right? It's not the student's fault that the transitions are sometimes challenging. So being mindful that you're the adult in the room to make everything okay. Sure, you can bitch later about things that are annoying you, but in the moment when you're teaching, you have to be the positive force, because your students are already going to be frustrated.
And what do you think, you mentioned flexibility, which I think is super important just in general for teaching, obviously. And then it sounds like even more so given, what, teachers are currently dealing with the pandemic. What are some other important skills, would you say, especially for that first year of teaching, to have?
The first thing I would say is to humble yourself. That's the biggest thing. Of course, you have spent hours, right, committing your time for free to working in schools and supporting students. Of course, you are, new graduates and the current trends in education. Of course, you're amazing, okay? But when you walk into a new space, there's people with 20 plus years of teaching experience. And of course, everyone can change, but humbling yourself and being open to other people's suggestions is really important, not only for learning and developing as a person, but also developing relationships with your coworkers. I really think it's important to have positive relationships with your coworkers, even if your teaching styles are different, because that sense of community is what really gets you through when you're having a bad day. So that's something that I highly recommend, and that's something I advise, is to humble yourself, take suggestions from other people, ask for help, even if you don't really need help. Just asking a veteran teacher, hey, I'm doing this, what do you think about it? That shows that you care and that you care about their thoughts, and then you can build a friendship through that. It's really important. So that's tip number one, is to humble yourself and ask for support. Tip number two is learn your boundaries, and learn and your limits, because Jen and I actually were talking about this earlier. So something I learned in college was to learn what my boundaries are. You're not going to be the best teacher you can be if you're burnt out, and teacher burnout is very real. It's a very emotionally and mentally taxing job. We love it, but it is taxing. So learning your boundaries, whatever that looks like. For me, I don't assign homework over the weekend, and I don't answer my email over the weekend. My students know this. I will not answer my email. You can access me Monday through Friday, but if you email me over the weekend, I will get back to you Monday at 8 a.m. That is a boundary that I discussed early on. And that's the thing. If you're going to set those boundaries, which I highly encourage that you do to protect yourself from that teacher burnout, set those expectations early and follow through. It's so easy, if I'm sitting around, oh, Sunday, I'm not doing anything. Oh, I guess I could answer this email. No, because that's a slippery slope. You need to take care of you so that you could be the best teacher you can be.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you saying that, Gracie, because it's something we've talked about in the past, and I think you make a really good point of, with that self-care, you have to make those boundaries at the beginning, because otherwise they won't be made. And it can be, I think, especially in particular, districts and things like that, it can be very easy to get sucked into this mentality of you have to be on 24/7. And I'm sure, some of you who are maybe currently doing student teaching might even be experiencing that, or see a cooperating teacher experiencing that. But if this is something that you want to do for a long time, you have to make sure that you have some of those boundaries. And so I think that your example of, over the weekend, I am not accessible, I think is a really, really good one, and a great example for, this is very, structured, and I communicate this in the very beginning, and it's understood by everyone, and that then they should expect on Monday morning that you'll be getting back to them. So I love that example.
Mm-hmm, for sure. And whatever your boundary is, like, that's my boundary that works for me. Maybe you have a different boundary that's gonna, provide time for yourself, but that's mine. You might find a different one, but I definitely do think you need to find time to be not a teacher.
Definitely. And so you were kind of sharing, kind of those tips, if you will, which kind of led into the self-care conversation, which is kind of going to be my next question. Aside from maybe setting some of those boundaries, what are things that you do for self-care?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So it can be simple things like listening to music on the way there and on the way home. If you don't have the song from Frozen, Let It Go on a playlist, download it, because you're gonna have to let a lot of things go when you walk out the doors at 3. I know I'm making a joke, but it's true. So, finding a routine during that transition time. We forget about the transition time from teacher mode to your life outside of school. So for me, that looks like sitting in the car and listening to music on the way home to get me in a good mood, and just to release any stress I had from the day, because you don't want to take something that happened during school and bring that home with you and continue to let it fester. Right? That's gonna, it's so easy to do that, way easier said than done. But developing a transition routine of, all right, I had my school day, I'm transitioning to my normal life outside of school. You need to develop that transition routine. So that's tip number 1 for supporting your mental health. Tip number 2, again, goes back to developing relationships with your coworkers. So whether that be like eating lunch with your coworkers, and yes, eat your lunch, don't work through your lunch. So eating your lunch with your coworkers, or hanging out with them outside of school, or just chatting it up during the passing period in the hallway. Developing a relationship with people that you can count on and that you can vent to and that will have your back is really important. And then tip number 3 goes back to that transition time of letting things go, but knowing when knowing your limits, right? So if you're continuously trying to let things go, and you built your transition time and you're still feeling stressed out, then you need to reevaluate what expectations you have for your day. Maybe you're trying to get too much done, or maybe you're being, and this is something that happens to new people a lot, maybe you're being taken advantage of, right? If someone's new, young, and excited, we'll just give her all the extra stuff that no one wants to do, right? So again, if you're finding that, oh, wow, I'm trying this transition time, or I'm trying my self-care and I'm still stressed out, you might be taking on too much. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's a great acknowledgement of, being taken advantage of. There's certain times when you're supposed to be working and things like that. And of course, teachers always work over that time, no matter what. And most people know that and accept that going into this career. However, there's, I would say, reasonable expectations around that, and there's very unreasonable ones. And so I appreciate you kind of acknowledging the fact that, you want to make sure that you're doing self-care and all those things, but you also want to make sure that you're sticking up for yourself, and you're, making sure that you're watching out for you and your mental health and what you can take on. So I appreciate that, because I think, thinking back to like my first year in CPS, you'll take on anything because you're excited to be there, and that's great, but you do have to think about it from a sustainability perspective, and thinking about how sustainable is this moving forward. And most teachers have that mentality of they want to do everything and do it well. And so really thinking and taking a step back, what can I take this on and do it well, and kind of framing in that mind, or in that way in your mind. If this isn't something I can do well at this time because of everything else I have on my plate, maybe this is something I have to say not right now too. Mm-hmm. So I appreciate that. So talk to us, and we're going to open it up for questions here in a minute. But I know, as a first year teacher, you might have some recommendations around kind of resources and things like that. Can you share a bit about that?
Yes. So as a first year teacher, so not in terms of like how to apply, where to apply, just like general resources. Okay. So as a first year teacher, you might think I need to plan every single lesson on my own. It's okay to get a little help from the internet. No one's gonna no one's gonna judge you for that. So I do have a couple of resources that I can actually share with my screen. But before I do that, I'll just give a brief overview. There's a couple websites that I have found really useful in terms of like pulling lesson ideas from. Of course, do you want to pull every lesson you have from the internet? No, but especially being new, if you've never taught something before, if you find lesson plans from credible sources, and I can show you in a minute what those are, that could be really helpful in learning like what the expectation is for a lesson. So that's resource number one. I'll share those websites in a minute. You can also go to your teachers again. To your coworkers, because teachers steal from each other all the time. It's something that's very accepted and normal. And so again, that goes back to like humbling yourself, asking, hey, do you have any resources on teaching Romeo and Juliet? I said that to one of my coworkers, and then the next day she gave me a binder full of stuff. Right. So teachers want to help each other. So don't forget that some of the best resources are in your school, which are your coworkers. So why don't I, Jen, is it okay if I just share my screen and I go through those? Okay.
For sure. I just made you co-host, so you should be able to now.
Beautiful. So they're gonna send this out in a bit, or I think later. But this is a little 2-page pamphlet that I made. Here are some general first year tips. We already talked about this, so I'll let this go for now. Getting more specific about these teacher resources. See, ideas for lesson plans. Teachers Pay Teachers, Read, Write, Think, PBS, Learning Media, and Scholastic are the four most common. If you need some lesson plan support, I highly recommend looking towards those. When it comes to technology, and especially since you guys are probably going to be teaching in a variety of different ways depending on where you land, I provided some technology resources. The most common learning management systems or like online school platforms. I know at DePaul we have like D2L. So think of Google Classroom and Schoology as the D2L for your students. Those are the two most common. I have Pear Deck, Slido, and ClassKick. These are 3 things that I have used. I know there's others out there, but these are 3 resources I have used to make my PowerPoints, my presentations more engaging, because then students can actually comment as I'm presenting and respond. So if I'm teaching something and then I pause and ask a question, then they can respond. So Pear Deck, Slido, and ClassKick create responsive presentations. In terms of like general practice or trivia or review, Kahoot, Quizzes, Poll Everywhere, Socrative, Edpuzzle, Quizlet, all of those are really great games or review tools that I highly recommend using. I'm not getting a stipend or anything for plugging these systems, but this is just what has worked for me. And then Parlay and Padlet are great for facilitating verbal and nonverbal participation. This is key, especially for remote learning. Parlay and Padlet allow students to like enter chat rooms and create posts where they can respond to each other and see each other's comments, and that way they can have an online dialogue. So these are some of the meaningful resources in terms of planning. I'll look at this more in depth later when it gets sent out. Lastly, some teacher support. I have the Calm app on my phone. I do this actually with my students on Wellness Wednesday. Every Wednesday we start off with like mental health support in the beginning of class. So we usually do something from like the Calm app. And they have like I had like a trial that was like free for teachers, and then I think there's like a discounted rate for teachers as well, so that's really cool. And then so just take a look at some of my mental health support, because taking care of you is super important, because you want to be the best version of yourself for your students, so never forget that. So yeah, these are some of my resources. Again, these resources are not exhaustive. This is just what's worked for me. Maybe you'll find some stuff that works for you, but I think this is a good starting point for sure. Cool.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that, Gracie. If we want to go back to full screen, we can see what questions are coming up from people. I think those resources will be super helpful. We always like when we can share some concrete things, but whether it's, having specific questions for Gracie around her experience as a first-year teacher, or again, going through that job search or interview process, or even general questions you might have about the job search process that I might be able to answer, feel free to unmute yourself or throw anything in the chat.
Okay, this is such a good question. So it is, how do you handle classroom management in the remote setting and hybrid setting? Amazing question. So right now, in terms of accountability, I'm going to be honest, it's been tough, right? It's been tough. So what I do, and what I'll continue to do, is I have a set of classroom rules, which are things that I, create myself. So in those classroom rules, I have rules about like putting your camera on if you can, and remaining on mute until it's your time to talk, and things like that under my classroom rules. And then we create classroom norms, which is different. And we create those together, and that is our guidance for our behavior and how we treat each other. And I've been able to refer back to those classroom norms because, for instance, for one of our classroom norms was participate to your fullest potential. So when I notice I ask a question, and this happens, so don't be afraid, this happens all the time, I'll ask a question, and because 90% of my students, are on Zoom at, any given point, it'll be crickets. And then I have referred back to my norms. I said, guys, remember what we wrote down? You said that it's important for us to participate to our fullest potential. Are we following this right now? And then that, that reminder of that, hey, this is what you decided on, has really been beneficial for classroom management, especially in terms of participation. In terms of behavioral outbursts, let's just call it that. So at my school, we haven't had any, well, first of all, we believe in a restorative justice practice. But even in that, the later part of the restorative justice practice where they, have a detention or an in-school suspension, that actually isn't happening right now. So a lot of teachers are left asking, all right, so what if a kid drops an F-bomb in the middle of class and nothing happens? Because I'm telling you, it has happened in my class, so it happens. And that, you have to go back to the relationships you develop with your students. So that's why it's important day one to introduce yourself and get to know your students. I usually do this by writing a letter to them, and then they write a letter to me. That type of dialogue has been really helpful. Again, I teach high schoolers, so it's a little bit easier to do that. Maybe if you teach with the younger folks, that you guys can do like icebreaker games, and that would be better. But when they are having some really egregious behavior, again, they're on Zoom, or they can leave the Zoom and be gone, So it comes back to developing relationships with your students and finding the time to pull them into a breakout room and say, hey, I noticed this is happening. What's going on? And asking what's going on instead of coming at them with the anger that they gave you. Taking a step back and allowing them to express what's going on 99% of the time has nothing to do with you, and has something to do with what's going on at home. So that's what I would suggest, is figure out what's going on with them first before following up with consequences of the next step. So yeah, did that answer your question?
Yes, it did actually. I was asking because I'm actually student teaching now, and those are some
Yeah.
of the things that we talk about quite a bit. How do you toe the line with classroom management online as well as in class? Because we're doing a little bit of both.
It's been tough, right? Because the second I turn to like my students online, someone in class pulls out their phone, right? And and just bringing it back. Remember the classroom rules, and I had them sign it too. So that's part of it. Remember what you signed up for. You said we would keep this away. So just going back to that has been helpful.
Really good question. Other questions that are popping up like that?
Don't be afraid to ask hot topic questions. I can be honest about things.
Yes, Gracie is very, very honest and very transparent. That's why we included her.
Okay, I have one more hot topic question.
Love it.
When it comes to getting hired, this process is very strange to me, how we're doing that in this setting right now. But when you finally get the contract, which could be a month from now, or however long that takes, how long does it take before your health insurance kicks in?
That's really good. So let me think back.
And this might be a case-by-case scenario. Like, Gracie, if you can remember, we would love to hear what your experience was. But I will say that it might depend on the district. Like, it could be like up to 30 days or something like that. Usually there's some sort of like, whatever the opposite of grace period is, where like almost like probationary period, where they want to make sure like, yes, indeed, you are going to be a full-time employee here. So it's usually not that day that you sign the contract. So do keep that in mind. But Gracie, do you remember when yours kicked in?
Yeah. So I agree with Jen. It's usually like that 30-day probationary, but actually, so this is what happened with me. So I got hired like May 5th it was, or something like that. And once I got my first paycheck, August 8th, then my HR department came down and like, here's your dental card, here's like all of that stuff. So I did not get like proof of insurance until I had my first paycheck, which was a little bit like, can be really frustrating, I think if you need proof of insurance, you can get that earlier before your, first paycheck, depending on like when that probationary period is over. But I remember that was my experience of like, I didn't get my insurance cards and proof of insurance until I had my first paycheck, which was, I got hired in May, and then my first paycheck came in August.
Yeah, and I would say that's fairly common. The other thing I would recommend is not necessarily asking the principal that question, because they really honestly will not know. And instead, like once you've accepted an offer, or even if you're about to accept an offer, you could ask to speak to someone from HR, and they would be able to answer that question versus like an administrator wouldn't necessarily be able to answer that.
Additionally, what you want to ask your HR is about like your retirement fund and how you're going to set that up, like your 403B and stuff like that. If you haven't ever set one up, I had to set one up for the first time. So, ask your HR department about like how that works and like different, because usually, I don't know about CPS, but I know in the suburbs, those schools have like brokerage companies. I think that's the correct term. That's not my world, but they have certain companies that they work with for their like 403Bs. So. Sure.
And then a question from Kathleen. This is a really good one. How confident were you going into teaching full-time in your own classroom? How do you break through the doubt and fear when given the responsibility of a class for the first time?
That's amazing. I'm still figuring that out. So and I'm gonna be honest, I'm 22, I'll be 23 in June. I'm 5 years older than the kids I'm teaching. So yeah. And I think And again, it goes back to this relationship building and how much you feel comfortable with sharing. I know they always say like, oh, don't tell your students how old you are if you're on the younger side. I didn't tell my freshmen, but I did tell my seniors like that, how old I was and when I graduated, because it, they were really mad and unmotivated because it was a COVID year and their senior year is being ruined, and we connected and bonded over that because my senior year was last year. So that, so just being honest that like, hey, this is my first year. And, I think, and again, I guess I can only speak for high schoolers. The fear of what your students will think of you is a lot smaller than we really think that it is. Or I don't know if I worded that correctly, but what your students think of you has a lot to do with your transparency. And they know when you're trying to fake that you know it. They know. And so, for instance, after every unit, I've given a reflection. I've asked them to fill out a Google Forms that said, hey guys, it's my first year of teaching. So I'm getting feedback about my teaching as well as your experience as a student. Tell me how things are going. And because I'm so transparent and honest and creating a learning community, that fear of feeling unprepared has gone away. Because I've gotten reassured from my students that like, Miss G, we love you, or like, you're doing the right thing, So being honest, and that's scary, like, right? Like, students can be scary, but being transparent, of course, there's always students who want to take advantage of the situation, and they're going to take advantage of any situation, no matter what you say. But being transparent about, being new, or if that is a conversation that comes up of like, oh, Miss G, you're new to this school. Like, have you taught anywhere before? You don't need to lie, because at the end of the day, what does it matter? You're still the adult that's in charge. So don't feel like you need to fake it, because students always find out. And in terms of like your own self-confidence, I still like am having days where I'm like, am I doing the right thing? And I'm talking to my dad, who is 4 years away from retiring, and he still has days when he comes home and goes, well, that didn't work. That is the career. All right. We're always growing. We're always learning. So this concept of having like first year doubts never really goes away. But if you take it as an opportunity to learn and grow and reflect, then you're going to be a successful teacher in the long run. So hopefully that helps.
Thanks for sharing that, Grace. And I think that was a really good question, and one that, most first year teachers are thinking and wondering about. And I really appreciate your honesty, Grace. And I think that you're exactly right that, as long as you're genuine with your students, that is 99% of it. So I think that's super, super helpful. A few more questions coming in. One from Regina. Can you talk a little bit about what it's like being observed by a principal or whoever might do that? Obviously can feel a little nerve-wracking, intimidating. And I'm assuming, Regina, you mean specifically for the interview process?
I actually mean like after you start teaching.
Oh,
okay.
Sure. As a first year teacher.
Yeah.
Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, Grace, can you talk about that a little bit?
Two things. So in my school, it's either the principal or the director of curriculum who observes you. They flip-flop every year. But that doesn't stop people from popping in your room constantly, at least in my experience. So you have unofficial observations that happen often when you're new, especially that first like month or two. I'm pretty sure my principal walked by at least twice a week and poked his head in just to see like what was going on. Could that be just the way that my principal likes to manage? Yes, it could be just his method. But it is not uncommon for administration when you're first starting out that first month to pop in a lot. Don't take it as they don't think you're doing the right thing or that you're in trouble. That's just kind of standard, and you are new, so they're just trying to see that if you're okay. So don't worry if the first month of school people keep popping in and you're like, oh my God, like I'm fine, like leave me alone. You know, they're just as anxious as you are. So don't take offense to it. They're just trying to do their job. Secondly, when you have those formal observations, so I did not get observed by my principal, I got observed by my director of curriculum, but again, still very high up in the administrative level. I had a pre-conference, and I don't know if this is common across all school districts, but before they observe you, we had a pre-conference to go over what she was looking for. So that is really important during that pre-conference before your formal observation, to ask her about what you're going to be evaluated on. Usually it's that Danielson framework that you guys learned about, you know, we all learned about in our ed classes. But in addition to that, you know, I straight up asked her, I said, so what's going to earn me a proficient, or what's going to earn me an exceeds or meet, you know, what will earn me a good score? Asking those specific questions during that pre-conference can really help you prepare for that special day when you get observed. And of course, we all know we pull out all the bells and whistles when we're getting observed. Do we go to the max every single day as if we're getting observed? Not necessarily. We always try really hard every single day, but during that period of observation, you want to be especially cognizant about the things that they told you in the pre-conference that they're going to be evaluating you on. Do you do those every single day? Depends on your teaching style, but you definitely want to do that during those observations.
Super helpful. So we have 2 more questions here. Awesome. When schools open in the fall, do you think students will be academically prepared to work at grade level? If not, how do you prepare for that after the year we've had?
Ask any teacher that question. Oh my God. Candidly, I don't think so. Candidly, I don't know if they are going to be 100% their best selves come next school year. For some students, maybe, and at some schools, maybe. But keep in mind that not everyone has had the same learning experience. So some of my students have been remote the entire time and have turned their camera on maybe once. Okay, that is very different from a kid who has come into school and has gone to tutoring sessions with me and this and that, right? So the level of engagement has been in flux this year. So certain kids, you know, definitely are up to speed and were able to complete assignments on time and learn all the things that they needed to. Some students are scraping by with a D-. And that's what the year, you know, we're in. So in terms of will students be academically prepared to work at grade level, I think that's a student by student basis. And for some students, it's going to require a lot of catch up and a lot of flexibility. Yeah, because as I am teaching my freshmen and my seniors, and even on a non, you know, COVID year, you'll say, didn't you learn how to use a comma before? No, this is the first time. Like, you know, so in a normal school year, there's always gaps, you know, somewhere. But I would say be prepared, because there will be some students who are behind. There are. And then in terms of how to address that, in terms of bringing them up to speed, this is where I always say you can lead a horse to water, right? But you can't make them drink it. So in terms of bringing a student up to speed, this, you know, hopefully your school has some sort of like initiative to bring them up to speed, or maybe is offering extra tutoring or something like that after school for struggling learners. If they are, fantastic. But if there's not anything like that going on, be prepared that you might have to schedule some extra tutoring sessions with students one-on-one or in small group. Is that extra work for you? Yes. Yes, that is. Is that annoying? Yes. But it's much better to take that like week or two to catch them up or bring them up to speed on a couple of skills that they may have missed so that they could be successful long term. So yeah, hopefully that was as honest as I could be.
Thanks, Gracie. And then let's end with this question. I think it's a good question. And I know it kind of depends on the type of classroom you're in. What type of relationship have you built with your substitute teachers, which would be applicable really anywhere? But then in addition, like SICAs and paraprofessionals, how do you make the relationship productive for the sake of your students? Knowing that, you know, it's a lot of personalities maybe in one room. What does that look like?
Yes. So with the substitute teachers, I love that you bring this up because I actually had a sub the other day that left a bad report for my freshman. So it happens, right? It happens, right? Every child, you know, always tries to get the edge. So sometimes when teacher's not here, you know, they might screw around a bit for the sub. It happens, you know. So in terms of developing that relationship with like substitutes, depending on the school, we usually have like 5 main substitutes that we always use. And like, you know, when we see them in the hallway, like say hello, you know, learn their first name, you know, the basics like that. And then if something were to happen, like how my students were acting messy while I was gone, taking the side, and again, you know, you want to be supportive of your students, but at the end of the day, if the substitute felt disrespected or, you know, whatever it was while they were substituting, I had all of my students write an apology letter, whether they feel that they misbehaved or not, apologizing to the substitute for, you know, giving them a bad experience at our school. So acknowledging, you know, the substitutes and, you know, building a positive relationship with those substitutes, because schools typically have like their main go-to people that they use for subbing. So, you know, if a substitute ever comes to you with a problem, like have their back, you know, and support them in that, and definitely learn their name. When you're leaving sub plans, be like overly detailed, leave notes about maybe some kids that might cause some problems, so that they're aware of that. And lastly, I reminded my students the day before, but I also sent or scheduled an email to go out that same morning, reminding my students that we're having this sub so that they know. So that's how I've handled like the whole sub situation. Always get to know the main subs that your school has and always support them if anything ever were to happen. In terms of paras, I don't have SICAs. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that.
It's very similar to a para.
Okay. So in terms of paras, I have a para in my freshman class, and it's really important to find time with your para to go over what the plan is for that week. You know, it doesn't have to be an hour-long meeting. Like it could even be sent in an email. Like, this is what we plan on doing this week. It can be really frustrating when you have paras in your classroom and they are showing up not knowing what you're doing that day and not knowing which students need help. Again, yes, this is required planning on your end. Yeah. But they are professionals who are trying to help you and your students and, you know, deserve that level of respect. So with my para, you know, even if I don't have all the kinks work out for the week, I tell her generally what we're doing each day. And either in the morning or at the beginning of the week, I send her, you know, these are the 4 kids that I need you to work with, and this is what they have missing. Can you work with them on this? And then, you know, come back to class with what we're doing. So just being as transparent as you can with your paras, filling them in on what you're doing each week, and giving them specific direction of which students need their support and what they can do with them. In Zoom sessions, a lot of times teachers will forget to make their paras a co-host. So whatever like learning system you're using, if you don't make your para a co-host, that can be very frustrating for them. Another way that you can make sure your students feel and look at the peers as, as equal to the teacher, because that's important too. Sometimes peers that students look down on them, is treating the para with respect. Like, don't talk to the para as if they're a student. If there's an issue and you have a miscommunication, talk to the para outside of school or in a place where students aren't listening. Because the reality is students need to work with your para or your SICA to get work done in a professional way. So students need to see and respect the para, and they can only learn that if you are modeling that behavior.
Awesome. Well, Gracie, we want to make sure that we're being respectful of your time. Being a first-year teacher, we know you're very busy and have a lot going on. We really, really appreciate you taking the time to come and talk about the job search experience, as well as just your first year teaching, and kind of share all your wisdom. We appreciate your honesty and transparency. So thank you again. Just a quick round of applause from Gracie. And I just have to say, being, somebody who's seen you grow throughout your time at DePaul to where you are now, I'm just like, you've always been very mature and, all of those things, but I'm just astounded at the professional that you're turning into.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Jen. Yeah, the Career Center and Jen and Libby all have a special place in my heart for sure.
Well, we appreciate that. And Libby is going to just launch a really quick poll for you guys. I think it's only like 3 questions. If you don't mind taking that, it helps us know how to kind of plan future programming for our particular career community. So we appreciate it. So thank you everyone for joining us. We know you guys are busy too with student teaching and classes. And so hopefully you found this helpful, and we will send out this presentation, the recording of it rather, and the resources from Gracie in a few days once that's gone through our communications team. So thank you very much, everyone. And feel free to make an appointment with me if questions come up about that job search process. Thanks again, Gracie.
Good luck, guys. Good luck.